populations du Liban sont venus voir les femmes et leur ont dit que la zone devenait dangereuse et qu'il fallait se sauver. Il y a eu énormément d'agressions dans les autres lieux. Alors les femmes
I think one has to go back in time to understand, first of all, to understand how the problem has evolved and why it didn't work out the way that many people hoped it would. You have to go back to the fact that it was the end of the Cold War. The expulsion of Iraq from Kuwait had been totally successful. There had been this international alliance. A lot of other positive things were happening in the Security Council. There was a sort of general euphoria, is hardly too strong a word, for a feeling that conflicts were all susceptible to solution. It's in that context that you have to see the proposals for the settlement of Western Sahara. This was a war over a significant chunk of territory involving two of Africa's most significant armies, the Moroccan, the Algerians backing the Polisario. And the feeling in New York at the time was that this has gone on a long time. The OAU, as it was still called, the Organization of African Unity, had failed to come up with any progress whatsoever in moving towards a solution. Let the UN deal with this, and now we can get agreement in the Security Council, and all problems are capable of being resolved. I mean, that was a little bit the feeling. Even though serious analysts realized that there were some pretty deep-rooted difficulties here, which helped to explain why the OAU, for example, had not been able to make any progress for as long as they had. It's in that context that Pérez de Cuéllar, then Secretary General, comes up with his settlement plan. It emerged afterwards that in fact both sides, both Morocco and the Polisario, had expressed really quite radical reservations to the proposal of the settlement plan. But these were not published, these were not made public, and they were not communicated officially to the Security Council. So the Security Council proceeds to adopt a settlement plan in circumstances where the well-informed members of the Council must have known that there were difficulties about it. But in the context of the post-Cold War period, in that context, people thought, well, we'll find a solution, we'll work it out. So the settlement plan was duly adopted. And it was only when the moment came when it was supposed to be implemented that suddenly more vocal objections occurred. And the Moroccans initially had strong objections. And then Pérez de Cuéllar was able to persuade the two sides, well, at least accept the ceasefire. And quite frankly, at that point, I suspect both sides believed the ceasefire was probably in their interests. So they did. Now that sounds fine, except for the fact that the ceasefire was linked in the settlement plan with certain other actions that were supposed to take place. And when you decouple it, you actually remove the incentive for some of the other things that were to happen. So the ceasefire was duly established, but none of the other things were. And then at the end of 91, just as he's about to retire, Pérez de Cuéllar submits some modifications, if you like, or clarifications, I think some people call it, to bits of the settlement plan to the Security Council, which include the basis of qualifying for the right to vote, because that had already emerged as a highly contentious issue. Why was it unsatisfactory? Well, it was unsatisfactory in one very basic and core element, if you like, which was who was going to vote in the referendum to determine what the future of the territory would be, whether it would be integrated into Morocco, whether it would become independent, or, as has later emerged, some other third way. But initially it was a choice between those two. So in most countries you have fairly clearly defined frontiers, and it's, give or take, pretty obvious who should be allowed to vote in a national referendum. Why not in the Sahara? Well, there is a good reason for it. Now, the Polisario would say, well, you could do just that. You could stay with a census which the Spanish colonial regime had carried out shortly before, and that was fine. Just go with that, the people listed in the census, nobody else. Morocco said no, because this census was incomplete. Now, the Spaniards themselves said it was incomplete. But, to what extent? Are we talking 10, 15%? So perhaps a margin. Why was it incomplete? Because it was perhaps done in a bit of a hurry, and because you have a very large area, it's the size of Britain, with a very small population, who are nomadic. So it's not an easy population to subject to a rigorous census. But much, much more important than that was that the Moroccans had a completely different attitude as to who should be officially taken as a West Saharan. because the frontiers laid down were your traditional imperial frontiers, straight lines drawn on a map without any relevance to any natural contours or to ethnic groups or anything like that. And the population in that area were, again, not a settled agricultural population, therefore susceptible to being cantoned in that way. They were nomads. And they were nomadic tribes who moved over vast areas. So you had some of these people who habitually moved, nomadise, and the French have a word for it, between what is now Mauritania, even into as far as Mali, some of them, I think, certainly into southern Algeria, and certainly into a large chunk of southern Morocco. And the Moroccans insisted that, therefore, to decide the future of the territory, which was part of a larger entity, if you like, purely on the basis of a population that happened to be in a particular confined area at a particular moment, was artificial. In addition, because many of the people who had been unhappy with Spanish colonialism were in fact out of the country at the time. It was on that basis that Pérez de Cuéllar came in with his clarifications, if you like, and established certain criteria. And then the understanding was that there would be an identification commission, which would be a UN body, an international body, which would endeavour to see how these criteria could be applied to all applicants, to see whether they qualified to be included and be allowed to vote or not. There was then another element, is how do you prove that you qualify under these? It was then said that this is a traditional society, they don't have much in the way of written records. The Polisario said immediately that any documents produced by the Moroccans would be considered suspect and therefore not acceptable. So the only way to carry out this exercise was to base it on oral testimony, and the oral testimony would have to be provided by tribal leaders. No outsiders, as far as I can make up to that, had even begun to understand this extremely complex tribal structure that they had. It was a complicated process, very complicated process, very time-consuming. It involved having one sheikh from each side. This stumbled on, well, it took the better part of 2 years. We had actually identified roughly the same number of people as were in the original census. But there was still a lot of candidates coming forward, and particularly candidates from what I chose to call, to the annoyance of some parties, the contested groups. Now, why were these contested? Because these were people from 3 huge tribes, where the majority of members of the tribe were known to be living outside the Western Sahara. And the Polisario had always said, well, we can't participate in identifying these because we don't even have sheikhs here to fulfill our side of the bargain. And Morocco said, of course, unless you identify these people, there's no way we can remain committed to the process. And we stumbled backwards and forwards, and it reached the point where I felt, because Boutros Ghali, by then Secretary, had always said to me that what he hoped I might be able to do, and he tried to do it himself first, but had not succeeded, was to get them together to work out some negotiated agreement. And now we go back to the original euphoria when the plan was adopted. Okay, maybe this plan isn't going to work, but it'll bring them together, it'll tie them into something, and then they'll talk, and then they'll work out a negotiated formula, and the compromise thus negotiated could itself be subject to a referendum, at which point it doesn't matter too much who votes in the referendum, but who doesn't, it doesn't become quite so contentious. The fact is that Morocco, from the very beginning, before the Holy Sun, never accepted the notion that the right to determine the future of the territory should be limited only to those who happen to be in a limited area at the time of the Spanish census.